Hi, it's Freeze Correct. I'm back talking about angles and tool choice and force delivery and all that kind of junk. Ouch. Some tools just don't work very well. I've used bone some, and there's several problems with bone. Number one, the main problem with bone is that it's too light for the most part. You can use it, but you want to use it on fairly sharp edges and material that's brittle enough to fracture without a whole lot of mass being applied to it. And you're going to have that issue of your speed's going to have to be higher, so the material has to have enough good tensile strength on the flakes and stuff to take it. Hey, I just noticed a leveloid flake. Look, I made a leveloid blade by accident. Another tool material that should almost never be used ever is steel. They do make some spalling hammers that are made out of non-heat treated, really soft mild steel or annealed steel. They may be heat treated, but they're heat treated for softness or whatever. But the problem with steel is it's too hard, and it has a shattering effect due to an almost instantaneous force delivery, and so it tends to break up rocks and stuff. One thing I wanted to mention is that there's nothing magical about copper for an entire tool. The only times copper the only thing about copper that's beneficial is, number one, its grabbiness, which only matters at the point where it contacts your workpiece. And then the only other aspect of it that matters that's specific to copper is whatever the relative compressibility and shockiness is of hitting it. So if you have a punch and you want to hit on the copper because that's the level of compressibility or hitness or hit rebound or non-shatteringness or whatever that you need, then hitting on the copper makes sense. But the rest of the tool, I mean, the reason this tool is almost all Delrin is because this part back here, it doesn't matter. Now you could say, well, it would be better if that whole thing was copper because then you could hit better. Not necessarily, because what you have to remember is what I told you before about if you counterbalance the back end of your tool, you know, it tends to cancel out some of what the front end does. So a front weighted tool is more effective in a lot of ways. The reason some guys use big solid copper is because they've learned to manage. They tend to have them fairly short and have it, you know, where the weight, most of the weight is not hanging out the back as a counterbalance like a kangaroo's tail. I just thought that up on the fly. You like that? But they want the heaviness. But there's a lot of things that weigh a lot, and that's why I'm saying there's nothing magical about copper. You could take, I mean, that's why lead-filled boppers exist, because the inside of the copper isn't as critical. Although I will say that lead-filled boppers, they deform better. They deform a little bit different when you hit something, and so the energy delivery is a tiny bit slower, I can tell, and so they have a little bit less of a shattering effect, and that's where the reputation of solid copper comes from, that you got to be good, and there's a learning curve, and it's unforgiving. Yeah, it's all those, and it's all because, you know, you do have to be more practiced with solid copper, because it's less forgiving. The reason the first hit just then didn't take a flake was because I was holding it backward a little bit and I didn't have it well supported. So when I hit it, it did this number. It bounced, and the back part of this canceled out the force from the front part, and it just let this go down and it didn't take the flake. So 100% of the reason that flake didn't run off of there like a racehorse is because of improper support, nothing else. The tool was fine, although big and kind of slow for this size piece, the rock is fine, but the, what they call it, the loose nut on the keyboard, the user's judgment on support was incorrect. But you know what? If I'd been hitting that with indirect, it wouldn't have mattered, because it's a lot faster. And sometimes with indirect, the force is gone, the flake is initiated before the rest of the piece has a chance to say, you know what, I don't like the way I'm being bent, I think I'll just break. Okay, angles. Somebody was saying, hey, show me the angle. Well, I've done this before on a different video, but I spared no expense in getting my visual aids for this, and I want to show you some angle stuff. Let's see. Oh yeah, this is on the screen. Okay. Here's preform. Here's your imaginary center line. Here's your swing. You have conchoidal fracture. Normally, when you have conchoidal fracture, I'm going to go up here for a second and talk about conchoidal fracture. When you have conchoidal fracture, and I've said this before, but you hit a flat plane, your cone of force comes off at a 50-degree angle each way from the center, so you got a 100-degree cone of force on your conchoidal fracture. So normally, if you're swinging straight down, most people swing in an arc though, but if your force vector is straight downward, then your flake is going to come off at 50 degrees from the force vector. So if this comes off at 50 degrees, obviously whichever way you swing is going to affect how much into this thing you cut. Well, what I'm trying to do normally is I turn my edge toward the downside when I'm preparing a continuous platform. I turn it towards the downside. So I have my edge more like this. And then what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to hit at an angle that's almost perfect to drive the flake through the piece. So I want my cone of force angle to come off at almost 50 degrees. I do not set the platform at the center line and hit to drive it straight through, because when you try and drive a flake straight through your preform, it don't work. Your flake doesn't know which way to cut through, and like it or not, you'll get a reverse hinge. But normally you're just going to break the thing in half when it comes in here and dies and shocks the piece to crap, and it just folds on you because you can't take that big a bite. What I always do, for the most part, if I want a thick flake, is I try and set the platform halfway between the center line and the face that I'm flaking. Halfway between. So halfway below the center line, almost even with the face down there. And if it's higher than that, you're going to shock your piece too much. You're going to have a tendency to drive shorter flakes. And if it's lower than that, you're going to tend to drive thin flakes that don't achieve much in the way of thinning and won't run as far because they're thin. A really thin little flake don't have a lot of legs to go all the way across your piece. It takes some meat on a flake for it to have enough mass momentum and push behind it going across to go all the way through. Also though, huge issue is your support. If you support underneath, it has a tendency to make the flake run thicker and more inward, and you can change the direction because it can't hinge down, so it has to crack because the force is high, and it cracks and the direction goes this way because it can't go that way. But in addition, it tends to seem to make it run deeper below the surface. So there are people who will pinch a little bit in the middle when they got a real big thin blade to try and keep the flake thin and thinning right at the center of a 3-inch blade or whatever. And sometimes the center of a 3-inch blade on these real ultra thin stuff can actually be thinner than the edges, which is counterintuitive, but it works. It's a train wreck, and if you do it wrong, because it's a little bit's great and a lot is terrible. But at any rate, so when you say, well, what angle am I hitting at, it dramatically depends, because you can change any of these variables. So if I'm hitting if I, for whatever reason, want to swing straight downward, I can just tilt my workpiece to whatever angle I need to make it still be a straight in flake. So I can hit like this. It's about like this. I'm hitting almost straight downward, and I can drive that flake all the way, you know, through. The other thing though is, if I hold it flatter, if I have a tendency to swing, some guys swing at a sideways kind of angle, and they swing flatter, and you can hold it almost flat and swing flatter if you want to. If you are using support, you can change everything, because number one, sometimes when I peg punch, I don't even have one of my peg punches here. Yeah, I do. When I'm peg punching with antler, I'll take and put a bunch of padding, and those times when I'll put it like the round shoulder thing on this and hit straight downward on padding, and that force can't go down, and it just shoots it sideways. And partially the shoulder, you know, if you have a rounded off area on your tool, well, it's like shooting pool, because you don't aim straight through your pool ball into the straight part of the other pool ball when you want to hit it at an angle. You got to take into account the shoulders, and the shoulders of the other thing, or the platform of the other thing, because this is at an angle and this is at an angle. So when I go to hit it, I have to imagine in my mind a little bit the shoulder contacting the angle and what that does as far as to what is almost straight through this thing. And I know it's complicated, but what ends up happening is all this theory that I'm telling you ends up kind of going out the window, because it becomes a matter, it's like riding a bicycle. You do it enough and pay attention to it and make the adjustments and figure it out, and at some point you'll get to where you do it right. I'm going to cut off all these deltas. See, they're gone. And once you get to that point, you're okay. And I've tried to think about how to tell y'all how to get to that point in videos, because it's kind of a critical issue, and I can't really think of how to tell you, but I'll tell you this. It happened for me at a knap-in, and it was a year or so ago, and I had been watching all these guys just wail on thin stuff, and it seemed impossible. And I'm like, how are they wailing on thin stuff? Well, it became obvious that the way they were wailing on thin stuff is they were hitting almost straight through it on the long axis to where it just doesn't vibrate and it doesn't shock and it doesn't cause a problem. So, you know, most people are napping something like this, and they're napping it from face to face. The people who are thinning the crap out of stuff and making huge blades are napping it from width to width. And they're cutting through like this, and when you cut through like this, there is no bending force on this, period. You can hit on the end, you can hit thick flakes, you can get away with murder if your force is through the piece, not direct through the dang middle, but anything other than that that's almost straight through. And you can get away with a lot. And basically it's like sometimes an overshot type almost flake is the safest type flake to take. So anyway, what happened was I'd been watching these guys, and I decided I would just keep hitting. I would just keep going with more and more angle inward and hit hard and see what happened. I would just do that. I was gonna ruin as much rock as necessary to figure out how to do what those guys were doing. Because what I knew they were doing was they were hitting hard on thin stuff and not breaking it. So how do you hit hard on thin stuff and don't break it? Well, you just don't hit the direction that the thinness is. You hit the other way. That was bad. That was really bad. Ew! Inadequate abrasion on a little cortexy area on a rock that doesn't have vast quantities of tensile strength. See, on a rock like this is that white kind of rock, and it's got a little bit of chalkiness in it. It's all different, you know. You just gotta go with the rock. So you gotta braid the crap out of it, and then it does what you want it to. Anyway, so what I noticed when I was doing that, though, I know I keep jumping around. Can't think today. What I want you to kind of remember is, number one, when you hit like that and you get it right, it feels different. It feels real different. Because what it feels like is the rock kicks back at you. It feels like, you know, you're used to taking your flakes, you swing and the flake goes and everything, and you follow through and all that kind of junk. When you get the angle perfectly right to where it's almost straight in but not quite, you better hang on to the rock, because it can really resist the strike and kind of kick back at you. But you swing hard enough, the crack initiates fast enough that you don't really feel that much, but the flakes just leap off like they're shot off. And the weird thing about it is how it looks, because when I first did it, it looks, when you're driving in on it, it looks like about half of the top of your bopper is above the edge, and it looks like you're just got to be shattering the piece. It doesn't look right. It's not intuitive at all. But for whatever reason, I can't walk and chew gum at the same time when I'm talking and crap. I just don't do stuff right. So that was like embarrassing, but I don't care. I think I'm going to publish all these stuff anyway with whatever scripts I do, because I really kind of feel like, number one, I kind of like showing screw-ups, because I think too many people don't show their screw-ups, and it makes everybody think that, oh, they're just wizards out there. No. And then the other thing is that my information, I think, is good. So whether or not I'm napping good on a given day, if I'm telling you stuff and the stuff I'm telling you seems okay to me, then that's all that matters. Okay, so angles. Angles. A lot of times I'll put stuff on the back of my leg if it's wide. And on that angle, one of the things I'm trying to do, you got to make sure that you hit the platform before you hit your leg. Of course, you need a bunch of padding, and I use like 3/4 of an inch of padding, but you could add more. Add as much padding as you want. But oh, and on the indirect too, it's a big issue. You want to make darn sure that, and I really don't think the way I do indirect is the best way. I think that it would be good to have it on top of my leg better. But if you're gonna have a bunch of padding on your leg and do indirect and stuff, you need to make sure that your padding is sufficient to where, if you're using a big punch like an antler or something, like if you're using something like this as your punch, Well, sometimes if you're not careful, the padding will get where it's under your punch too much to where when you hit it, it doesn't effectively translate the energy into your workpiece because too much of it's being absorbed by the padding. So you got to make sure that the padding is sufficiently cleared from your work or whatever to where you're not getting the padding absorbing all your energy. Okay, so talked a lot and not said much. Somebody said something about making a punch out of like a copper cap. No, I don't see that working because the punches take a whole lot of abuse, and so a lead-filled bopper type cap doesn't seem to me like it would last long at all on a punch, because it's just a lot more violent force going on than with the hand swung direct percussors. And you really kind of owe it to yourself to try the indirect, maybe just to see what it'll do for you, because give it a little bit and try it. And I'm not advocating that anybody go to using it full time if they don't need it for some reason, like an inability to use direct or whatever. But as a special purpose tool, it can be incredible with some of the stuff it can do. It can really do some amazing things sometimes. All right, I'm stopping. Bye for now, freeze crack.